The Pacific skies burned red that morning. A lone Corsair tore through clouds of black flak, its gull wings cutting like knives through smoke and chaos. Enemy Zeros swarmed in, dozens of them, their engines screaming like banshees. The pilot's breathing quickened, oxygen mask fogging, fingers tightening around the trigger. He had seconds. Then something shifted. The faint green glow of his gun sight shimmered on the canopy glass, steady, calm, almost whispering to him. With a single pull, 3 Zeros vanished into fire. The others scattered. They never saw it coming. What the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans had just unleashed a silent revolution, one that would turn ordinary pilots into skybound snipers. By late 1944, the Pacific War was a storm without end. The Japanese Zero still ruled the dogfight, faster, lighter, deadlier in a turn. But the U.S. Navy had a new beast, the F-4U Corsair, its bent wings giving it the nickname Whistling Death. Even so, many Corsair pilots were dying, missing their shots by inches, losing to more agile enemies. That's when engineers back home began asking the impossible. What if a pilot didn't need to guess anymore? What if technology could predict where his bullets would meet the target before he even fired? Thus began the secret race to perfect a device that would change aerial warfare forever, the Gyro Gunsight. British scientists had started it, experimenting with a sight that used spinning gyroscopes to calculate lead automatically. It seemed like science fiction, until American engineers at Sperry and Colesman took the idea further. They adapted it for naval aircraft, calibrating it for the Corsair's brutal acceleration and roll rates. The first pilots who tested it didn't believe their eyes. Instead of chasing the enemy's shadow through the crosshairs, they simply placed the glowing ring over their target and fired. Hits came faster, more precise, almost too easy. The kill ratios began to climb. The once feared Japanese aces now found themselves hunted by men who could fire with mathematical certainty. But behind those glowing reticles and kill counts lay a deeper truth. The Gyro Gunsight didn't just make pilots better, it changed how they thought. Combat became less about instinct and more about trust in a machine's prediction. Some called it genius. Others whispered it was the beginning of something darker, the end of the human pilot's art. And as Corsair squadrons prepared for the next major offensive, Japan's top aces began to notice something terrifying. Their once invincible tactics were failing. The Americans weren't guessing anymore. They were seeing the future. Night over the Pacific. The ocean below was a sheet of ink, unbroken except for the brief flashes of tracer fire cutting through the darkness. Inside his cockpit, Lieutenant Harris felt the hum of his Corsair like a living heartbeat. Then it appeared, a faint flicker on the horizon, a shadowed Zero banking for a kill. Harris didn't think, he sensed. His thumb grazed the trigger, but his eyes locked on the new sight in front of him. The circle moved, dancing, pulsing, alive, calculating his every motion. He aimed not where the Zero was, but where it would be. One breath. One squeeze, the enemy erupted into fire before it even knew it was being hunted. Harris whispered to himself, "This thing, it sees before I do." The secret behind that glowing reticle was astonishingly simple and impossibly complex. Traditional gun sights relied on steady hands and instinct, demanding pilots calculate deflection angles at hundreds of miles per hour. But the Gyro Gunsight Mark II, and later the K-14, rewrote the laws of air combat. Inside its metal frame, 2 gyroscopes spun furiously, measuring the rate of turn and angle of attack. As the pilot tracked his target, the system predicted the enemy's future position and adjusted the sight automatically. Suddenly, even a split-second hesitation became irrelevant. The machine thought faster than the man. What once required years of combat experience could now be learned in days. But progress never came without fear. Many veteran pilots distrusted the new sight, calling it witchcraft in a box. They'd been trained to rely on instinct, on feel, not math. Some even refused to use it, until the results began to speak. Newer recruits, barely out of training, started racking up kill counts once thought impossible. Reports flooded command. 3 Zeros down in one pass. 2 bogies eliminated before visual contact. Word spread through the fleet like wildfire. Something was happening in those Corsairs. Something that defied logic. The Japanese pilots, once masters of dogfighting, began describing the Americans as ghost shooters. They couldn't understand how the enemy fired so perfectly, so coldly as if death itself had a targeting computer. But inside the hangars, another kind of tension brewed. The engineers and commanders knew this secret couldn't stay hidden forever. If Japan or anyone uncovered how the gyro worked, the balance of the air war would shatter overnight. So the Navy buried it in secrecy, scrubbing the term Gyro Gunsight from reports and replacing it with vague code names. Even the pilots didn't know exactly how it worked. They just knew it made them unstoppable. And yet, in the stillness after battle, some wondered, if this machine could predict movement so precisely, what would happen when war demanded something even smarter? Something that didn't just calculate angles but made decisions? The line between man and machine had begun to blur, and the sky was only the beginning. The sun rose blood orange over the Solomon Islands. From the carrier deck, pilots watched vapor ghosts swirl off the ocean, each misted wisp a promise of another fight. Lieutenant Bauer's hands trembled around his helmet strap. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of missing. Above, his Corsair's gun sight shimmered to life, the glass glowing with that eerie, perfect ring. He'd come to trust it more than his own heartbeat. When the Japanese formation appeared, a black swarm moving with surgical grace, Bowers didn't blink. He followed the circle. It led him like fate. 1 pass, 3 kills. His voice cracked over the radio. It's like the sight reads my mind. But somewhere deep inside, a darker thought whispered, or maybe it's the other way around. Behind the frontline glamour, a quiet rivalry brewed, not between nations, but between instinct and innovation. Old-school aces believed a real pilot felt the fight, reading the wind and the sun's angle. The younger ones, the new breed, trusted the gyros, the data, the precision of machine prediction. On every carrier, the divide grew sharper. Mess hall arguments turned into shouting matches. You think you're aces because of a toy? Veterans scoffed. That toy just saved your wingman, the rookies shot back. For the first time, the battlefield wasn't just in the sky, it was in the cockpit, between a pilot's gut and a machine's logic. Command saw the shift and acted fast. The Navy launched secret training programs called Operation Sightline, crash courses designed to fuse man and machine. Pilots learned to read the reticle's pulse as if it were part of their own reflexes. The results were astonishing. Kill-to-loss ratios doubled in weeks. Instructors reported something stranger still. The best pilots no longer looked at the target. They looked through it, as though their vision extended beyond human timing. Psychologists were flown in, trying to understand how trust in a mechanical eye could rewire the brain's sense of space. The Gyro Gunsight was no longer a tool. It was becoming an instinct amplifier. And that terrified those who had once believed human intuition was untouchable. Then came the mission that proved everything and nearly broke them all. A squadron of Corsairs intercepted a zero formation over Leyte Gulf. The battle lasted barely 2 minutes. 11 enemy aircraft destroyed. No American losses. When the footage was reviewed, analysts noticed something chilling. Every confirmed hit occurred exactly within the gunsight's predicted ring, down to milliseconds. The pilots had become living extensions of the machine. Admirals called it efficiency. Philosophers called it surrender. Because for the first time in aviation history, machines weren't assisting men. They were directing them. And the question echoing through the carriers that night wasn't about victory. It was about control. They called them the Ghost Squadrons. At dusk, when the sun bled across the Pacific horizon, they appeared without warning. Corsairs flying in formation so tight and silent that Japanese lookouts swore they were hallucinations. Then, in less than 60 seconds, the skies erupted in thunder. Planes fell from the clouds like flaming wrecks, and when the smoke cleared, the Corsairs were already gone. No one knew how they struck with such precision. Radio chatter spoke of invisible Americans and cursed gunners who never miss. But there was nothing supernatural about it. It was the machine, the Gyro Gunsight, that turned mortal men into phantoms of death. As the war dragged on into late 1944, the Japanese command struggled to explain these new tactics. They intercepted fragments of U.S. transmissions mentioning sightlink and predictive fire, but none of it made sense. Traditional dogfighting doctrine no longer applied. The Corsairs didn't chase their prey anymore. They anticipated them, striking from impossible angles with shots that should have missed. In one infamous engagement over Okinawa, a flight of 4 Corsairs downed 12 Zeros in under 3 minutes. Analysts in Tokyo tried to reproduce the maneuver in simulators but failed. It's like they already knew where we'd be, one captured pilot said, shaking his head. They didn't fight us. They hunted us. The U.S. Navy seized on this fear and weaponized it. Rumors were deliberately spread, stories of radar-guided eyes and pilots connected to computers. Japanese intelligence scrambled to verify, wasting resources chasing ghosts that didn't exist. In truth, the secret lay in a few pounds of metal and glass bolted to the cockpit, an invention few even understood. But as victory grew closer, a darker question surfaced among American ranks. Some pilots began losing sleep, haunted by how easy it had become. "You just line up the ring," one said quietly, "and pull the trigger. You don't even see their faces anymore." For some, the gyro wasn't just a sight, it was a mask, blinding them from the horror of what they'd become. When the Japanese finally captured fragments of a downed Corsair, their scientists disassembled the gunsight. What they found terrified them. "It predicts the enemy's movement before it happens," one report concluded. They had no countermeasure, no defense, so they turned to desperation, suicide missions, kamikaze attacks, human precision against mechanical perfection. The skies became a contest between faith and calculation, instinct and algorithm. And as the war reached its final brutal phase, one truth emerged from the wreckage. The future of combat no longer belonged to courage, it belonged to prediction. But deep within the American fleet, whispers began of something even greater, a secret project that would take the idea of prediction to an entirely new level. The war was supposed to be ending, but inside a dimly lit hangar somewhere in San Diego, a new kind of war was just beginning. Engineers huddled over a Corsair stripped to its bones. The wings were bare, the canopy removed, and in its place stood something strange, an experimental device connected by wires, spinning gyros, and flickering lights. The project was called Reflex, a name chosen to sound harmless. But to the few who knew the truth, it represented something terrifying. The goal was no longer accuracy. It was anticipation. The machine wouldn't just predict where the target was going. It would learn from every pilot's motion, adapting, improving. A gunsight that could think. The idea was born out of desperation and vision. After the Gyro Gunsight's overwhelming success, military scientists realized its limits. It could calculate trajectory, but not strategy. So a team at the Naval Research Laboratory began experimenting with analog computation, the earliest seeds of what would later be known as artificial intelligence. By wiring feedback loops into the gunsight, they made it respond faster to pilot inputs. It didn't just measure movement, it remembered it. Over time, it began to subtly guide pilots toward optimal attack patterns, nudging them into better shooting angles. Most never noticed the difference. But flight logs told the story. Reaction times improved, hit percentages soared. The sight wasn't just assisting anymore, it was training its user. Yet progress came with consequences. Pilots started describing odd sensations, feeling the aircraft react before they moved. "It's like it knows what I'm about to do," one said. Others reported flashes of anticipation, brief moments where the reticle seemed to move on its own. Command brushed off the claims as fatigue, but data analysts knew better. The sight was feeding patterns back into the pilot's reflexes, conditioning them. Over time, their natural instincts were overwritten by predictive patterns. The line blurred between man and mechanism. When test results showed one pilot achieving a near 100% hit ratio, researchers celebrated. But in the footage, something was off. His movements were too precise, too mechanical, almost robotic. "We built a mirror," one engineer whispered, "and it's starting to look back." Word of Project Reflex never reached the press. Files were sealed, personnel reassigned, and prototypes quietly scrapped, or so history says. But fragments of its technology lived on. The same predictive logic found its way into post-war designs, guiding the birth of radar-assisted targeting, missile locks, and early flight computers. The Corsair, once just a warplane, had become the ancestor of something much greater, machines that could think faster than the men who flew them. And though the war would soon end, the ideas born inside that hangar refused to die. The dawn over the Philippines was deceptive, golden light spilling across islands that hid death beneath. Squadron 213 waited on deck, engines humming like predators in the grass. Lieutenant Daniels stared at the sky through the canopy, knowing the enemy would come in waves, but he had a secret. The Gyro Gunsight glowed faint green, almost imperceptible, yet it pulsed with confidence. As the first zeros appeared, a black arrowhead streaking from the clouds, Daniels felt the strange calm only the instrument could inspire. He squeezed the trigger once and the lead enemy plane erupted. Seconds later, another. By the time smoke curled from the deck below, the Corsairs had already vanished. Invisible hunters, untouchable, untamed. The invisible edge wasn't just technology, it was strategy incarnate. Naval commanders recognized that the gyros gave the U.S. Navy more than marksmanship. They offered psychological dominance. Japanese pilots, famed for their audacity, now hesitated, eyes darting nervously at every shadow. Intelligence reports recorded a new term, ghost precision. Leaders realized that winning the air wasn't only about raw numbers, it was about perception. A pilot with the gyro had seconds to neutralize multiple threats before the enemy even knew he was there. In the chaotic calculus of war, those seconds became lifetimes. The edge was invisible but lethal, yet mastery came at a cost. Some pilots began relying too much on the sight, ignoring gut instinct and situational awareness. Training exercises revealed eerie patterns, planes moving precisely, almost mechanically, as if pilots were extensions of their machines. On one mission over Mindoro, Daniel's squadron encountered a rare formation of enemy aces. One pilot, experienced and fearless, tried to outmaneuver them, but every move was anticipated. He went down with perfect timing. Command began to wonder, were the gyros making men better or were they erasing individuality? The line between human skill and machine prediction blurred, leaving only efficiency, and an unsettling question. How far could this invisible edge stretch before it consumed the very pilots who wielded it? By the time the sun set on that campaign, the invisible edge had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. Reports from captured Zeros described an almost supernatural precision. Pilots who fired first, killed cleanly, and disappeared. And in the quiet moments between sorties, veterans whispered about what they saw in the gun sight, not just where the bullets would go, but glimpses of what might happen next. Technology had given them victory, yes, but it had also given them foresight, and with foresight came responsibility. And fear. The war in the skies had entered a new era, where death was not just fast, but preordained. Inside the cramped hangars of Pearl Harbor, a quiet storm was brewing. Engineers huddled over tools, wires, and instruments, their hands shaking with urgency. Outside, Corsairs roared past, each pilot oblivious to the invisible revolution reshaping their world. Lieutenant McAllister sat on the edge of a crate, staring at the glowing reticle of his gun sight, feeling a strange connection, as if the machine was an extension of his nervous system. Every twitch of the throttle, every roll of the plane, synced perfectly with the device's calculations. It wasn't just assisting him, it was teaching him. And in that instant, McAllister realized no one would see this coming. Not the Japanese, not even his comrades. The revolution wasn't loud or public, it was silent, subtle, almost invisible. While war raged in the skies, the engineers behind the Gyro Gunsight were rewriting human behavior, merging man and machine in ways that science had barely imagined. Training manuals were rewritten yet deliberately vague. Pilots learned not by reading but by instinct, guided by a circle of light that promised death to their enemies and survival to themselves. The Navy called it progress. Skeptics whispered of dependency. Each flight became a lesson, each mission a test. The pilots weren't aware of how much they were learning or how much they were changing, but every revolution faces resistance. Veteran aces, proud and stubborn, resisted the allure of automation. A man should fly with his gut, not a machine, one grumbled. And yet the results were undeniable. Kill ratios soared. Even rookies, fresh from flight school, could dispatch enemy aircraft with surgical precision. Intelligence reports confirmed a terrifying truth. The Gyro Gunsight had leveled the playing field, erasing experience as a shield. Human skill was no longer the deciding factor. Some pilots felt exhilaration. Others felt unease. They were winning, but at a price. The line between human intuition and machine calculation had begun to vanish, and no one knew which side would ultimately prevail. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the decks and runways, the Corsairs prepared for another sortie. McAllister ran his hands over the canopy, feeling the familiar hum of the instrument beneath his fingertips. Somewhere deep in the cockpit, he understood the truth. This was no longer just a tool. It was a silent revolution, a force that reshaped pilots from hunters into preternatural predators. And the enemy? They would never see it coming. Not until the tracers lit the sky and their own machines betrayed them in the blink of an eye. Over the waters near Formosa, the air shimmered with heat and tension. Lieutenant Callahan gripped his Corsair's controls, his knuckles white, eyes locked on a formation of Japanese Zeros. But it wasn't fear that drove him, it was obsession. The Gyro Gunsight glowed faint green, a steady heartbeat in the chaos, guiding him relentlessly. Every movement of the enemy, every twitch of his own plane was calculated, predicted, anticipated. One false step, one miscalculation, and a life would be lost. Yet Callahan couldn't stop. The ring demanded perfection, and he obeyed. Each victory felt hollow, yet intoxicating. The hunt had become a compulsion, and the machine was its master. The obsession wasn't unique to Callahan. Across the Pacific, pilots whispered the same words. "I can't fly without it." The Gyro Gunsight had become more than a tool. It was a tutor, a guide, and a temptation. Training programs reinforced precision, teaching men to trust calculations over instinct, timing over intuition. Flight logs recorded astonishing feats, pilots executing impossible maneuvers with mechanical consistency. And yet, with every perfect shot, the thrill was mingled with a quiet dread. Machines were teaching men to kill flawlessly, and some began to wonder if they were learning too well. Command noticed the shift. Reports of obsessive focus, pilots pushing themselves to the brink, sometimes ignoring protocol, began to surface. Psychologists were brought in to monitor behavior. "They're losing touch with the chaos of battle," one warned. "The machine is becoming the master." But at the same time, victories multiplied. Entire squadrons seemed unstoppable. The Japanese could not adapt. Aerial engagements became terrifyingly efficient, precise, almost surgical. Every sortie was a lesson in the power of prediction, every kill a proof of how deeply the technology had embedded itself into human reflex. Obsession and genius were inseparable, and the skies themselves were the proving ground. By the time dusk fell, Corsairs were streaking across the horizon like green ghosts. Callahan's squadron returned to the carrier, victorious yet hollow. He removed his helmet, sweat and salt mixing on his face, and stared at the fading light. The obsession lingered, not just with him, but with every pilot who had touched the glowing ring. Precision had become compulsion, victory had become addiction. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the hangar, the engineer's creation pulsed, waiting for the next hand to guide it. The machine had taught humanity a deadly lesson. Perfection is irresistible, and in its pursuit, even the strongest may lose themselves. Above the Philippine Sea, dawn broke with an eerie stillness. Squadron 47 cut through low clouds, engines whining, eyes scanning the horizon. The Japanese were coming, this time smarter, faster, hungrier. Lieutenant Harris felt the familiar hum of his Gyro Gunsight beneath his fingers. The circle glowed, calculating, predicting, whispering the path to victory. But this time, the enemy moved differently. Coordinated, unpredictable, trained to counter the invisible hunters. Each pulse of the gunsight demanded perfection. One misstep, one misjudgment, and a life would be lost. The battle had evolved, and so had the stakes. The Japanese had noticed the pattern. Ghost squadrons and their eerie precision forced a change in tactics. Pilots trained in evasive maneuvers, formations shifted, attacks became deceptive and sudden. Intelligence reports detailed attempts to reverse engineer the gyro principle, though understanding it remained beyond their grasp. Air battles turned into a deadly chess game where anticipation met counter-anticipation. The Corsairs were no longer just hunters. They were contestants in a relentless duel of foresight, a test of machine against instinct, technology against ingenuity. Despite the enemy's efforts, the ghosts persisted. The gyros adapted, teaching pilots to react faster, anticipate not only movement but intent. A veteran Corsair pilot recounted a fight over Lady Gulf. "I fired where they should have been, and they were already gone." The gunsight's predictive logic melded with human intuition, creating a hybrid, part man, part machine, wholly lethal. Even when the Japanese launched coordinated waves, the Corsairs struck first, vanishing before counters could be mounted. The invisible edge remained, proving that while tactics evolve, raw precision fused with foresight was nearly unstoppable. By nightfall, both sides had changed. The Japanese pilots, exhausted and fearful, whispered legends of ghosts that vanished as quickly as they struck. Meanwhile, the Americans returned to their carriers, faces streaked with sweat and grime, hearts still racing, minds altered. The gyros hadn't just improved combat, they had transformed the way men thought, fought, and survived. And somewhere in the silent hum of the hangars, engineers logged every encounter, every movement, every kill, knowing the invisible revolution they had begun was only growing. The sky had become a theater of shadows, where humans and machines danced a deadly waltz, and no one could see who would lead next. Above the waters near Okinawa, Lieutenant Reynolds paused mid-roll, his Corsair twisting like a living thing beneath him. The enemy formation was tight, precise, and deadly, but so was he. The Gyro Gunsight glowed faint green, guiding his every movement. Yet a question gnawed at him. Was this victory truly his? Each target exploded in the sky before it could even react. Reynolds felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The machine did the thinking, the predicting, the killing. He was just a conduit. And for the first time he wondered, not if he could survive, but if he could live with what he had become. The ethical dilemmas were invisible but real. Pilots, once celebrated for skill and daring, now relied on preternatural precision, almost a co-pilot in the cockpit made of metal and gyros. Command saw numbers, statistics, and unprecedented efficiency. Psychologists and strategists saw something else. A shift in consciousness, a dependence on a device that anticipated, predicted, and dictated. Some pilots embraced it, reveling in perfection. Others recoiled, haunted by the realization that instinct was being replaced by calculation, courage by certainty. The line between man and machine blurred, raising questions that no after-action report could answer. At a debrief in the Pacific, veterans argued with rookies over the role of technology in the war. "We're still men," one cried. "We're just killing faster," another countered. Yet every sortie seemed to reinforce the machine's dominance. Even when Japanese aces executed brilliant maneuvers, the gyros predicted their moves. Pilots began to speak in hushed tones of a guiding hand, almost supernatural, almost divine. The ethical edge had become as tangible as the invisible one in the sky. Humans wielded godlike precision, but the question lingered. Was mastery worth the cost of surrendering free will? As twilight fell over the Pacific, Corsairs returned to their carriers, silent except for the drone of engines and the faint hum of gyros cooling in the night air. Reynolds removed his helmet, staring at his hands, feeling the weight of the unseen power he carried. Machines had made him unstoppable, but at what price? Somewhere in the shadows of engineering rooms and strategy halls, the architects of this technology smiled and worried in equal measure. For every victory, every ghostly strike, there was a lingering question. In teaching men to see the future, had they stripped them of themselves? The war was being won, yes, but the soul of the pilot had become another battlefield. The war had ended, but the echoes of the Pacific skies lingered. In abandoned hangars, Corsairs sat silent, wings dusted with salt and history. Yet inside some of those cockpits, the glow of the Gyro Gunsight seemed almost alive in memory, a ghostly pulse embedded in the pilot's mind. Lieutenant Callahan ran his fingers over the faded canopy, remembering the hunts, the kills, the precision that had once consumed him. It wasn't just a machine. It was a teacher, a predator, a shadow that never left. Somewhere he realized the invisible snipers had not gone. They had evolved, leaving a legacy far beyond the war. Engineers and strategists pored over war records, fascinated and alarmed. The Gyro Gunsight had not only changed battles, it had changed men. Post-war designs borrowed its logic: radar-assisted targeting, guided missiles, early flight computers. The deadly precision that once turned Corsair pilots into unstoppable hunters became the blueprint for the next generation of aerial warfare. Yet with progress came unease. Historians and military analysts debated the consequences. Technology that made men infallible in war had also made them reliant, vulnerable to the next invention, and forever altered the art of flying. The ghosts of the Pacific were no longer just memories. They were seeds of a future humanity could not yet see. Veterans often spoke in hushed tones of their time in the sky. Some celebrated the machine's guidance, calling it salvation. Others mourned the loss of instinct, the surrender of intuition to a glowing ring of green light. Flight schools incorporated lessons learned from the gyro, but the human element, the chaos, the daring, the unpredictability, was diminishing. Reports hinted at a subtle tension. The more precise the pilot became, the more he trusted the machine, and the more he forgot what it meant to fly by, feel alone. The revolution was complete. Man and machine had fused, but the question remained: at what cost? Even decades later, the story persisted, whispered in hangars and flight museums, told to cadets as both caution and inspiration. The invisible snipers had left a mark not only on the Pacific, but on the very nature of combat itself. Precision, prediction, and the melding of human and machine had become the new standard, and the world had learned that once technology teaches men to anticipate death, that knowledge never truly fades. Somewhere, in the quiet hum of a simulator or the cockpit of a modern fighter, the ghost of the Gyro Gunsight still lives, waiting to remind pilots that the line between man and machine is thinner than they dare imagine. The Pacific skies had long fallen silent. The Corsairs, once fierce hunters, now rested in museums, wings gleaming under fluorescent lights. Yet somewhere deep in the minds of those who flew them, the glow of the Gyro Gunsight never truly faded. Lieutenant McAllister closed his eyes and saw the green circle, pulsing with life, predicting every enemy movement before it happened. It was no longer just a relic of war, it was a prophecy. A glimpse of a future where machines see before men, where prediction replaces instinct, where death arrives with mathematical certainty, and suddenly the future felt closer than ever, watching, waiting, always. The technology that had turned pilots into invisible snipers had grown, evolved, and spread. Radar, guided missiles, and modern flight computers all carried the DNA of the Gyro Gunsight. Military scientists and engineers realized the terrifying potential. If machines could predict outcomes with such precision in the air, what else could they predict? Strategy, human behavior, even the tides of war itself. The quiet revolution that had begun in San Diego hangars had reshaped the world, blurring the line between human intuition and algorithmic foresight. The ghost of the Corsair's circle of light had become a harbinger of a new era, but with foresight came responsibility and fear. Pilots of the modern age faced machines that could think faster than they could react. Autopilots, predictive targeting, and artificial intelligence promised unmatched efficiency, but also a loss of control. The lessons of the Pacific echoed. Precision was intoxicating, irresistible, and dangerous. Every pilot had to ask themselves, who truly directs the fight, the man in the cockpit or the machine in the loop? The ghosts of the Gyro Gunsight whispered the answer, lingering between the sensors, circuits, and human reflexes, waiting for the next generation to realize that the future doesn't just happen. It sees you first. As dusk fell over modern runways and flight simulators, the echoes of Corsair wings and green glowing reticles lingered in memory and machine alike. Humanity had glimpsed the edge of prediction, the haunting power of invisible precision, and the fusion of instinct with technology. The skies had taught a lesson. Once a machine teaches a man to foresee death, nothing is ever the same. And somewhere, in the whir of sensors, the pulse of gyros, and the quiet hum of circuits, the ghosts of the Pacific watch waiting, reminding us that the future sees everything. Before we even do,